Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. In this episode, we welcome Regina Harris Baiocchi to the podcast. Regina is an author, poet, and educator. Her music has been performed by symphonies and musical organizations across the U.S. and around the world. Her poetry and prose have appeared in prestigious journals. She is the author of multiple books, fiction and nonfiction, poetry, prose, and for the stage. Thank you, Regina, for taking a few moments out of your busy schedule to join the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. You are both an accomplished composer and a writer. How are composing music and writing words the same, and how are they different?
How are they the same and how are they different? Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because when I was thinking about doing this podcast today, one of the things that came to mind is that I love writing music because I love the sight and sound of words coming together to fill what I call a poetry vessel. And I also like the idea of notes and music coming together so that I can fill a music vessel. So they're similar in that sense, that I'm putting two entities together and creating, something called music, something called poetry. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, the idea of filling up a vessel, I think, is a great image. So when you decide on the form and arrangement of a piece of music or structure of a poem, does that happen in the beginning or emerge as you start playing with sounds and words?
It depends. I'm working on a couple of projects now. Some of them are easier than others in the sense that, for instance, I'm working on some vocal music where I was asked by a singer to set a poem to music. And I really resonate with the poem. And there are times when I'm, very fortunate that I do resonate with the poetry because it kind of sets itself. I mean, I have an idea of what it sounds like in terms of when it's spoken. And so I also hear musical versions of poetry. And then there are other times when I don't necessarily resonate with the poetry, where I really have to work at it. And so that's when my compositional learning steps in. So I know the elements for writing a good song. I know the elements for writing a good composition. So I try to start with a gesture that will hook people or will pique their interest and take them from there. And, on the other hand, sometimes I don't write introductions until I'm done with the piece. So you can take everything I said and throw out the window.
Well, talking about your music, which I was listening to as a backdrop while researching your work and authoring these questions, your music seems to have threads of jazz, blues, modern classical, and other forms. I'm not really sure how to describe or classify your music other than what you create is just so lovely. How do you describe your music?
I try not to. It'd be interesting if you tell me what you were listening to. I could probably tell you how I would describe that particular piece. But I like to dip in as many wells as I possibly can. There are times when I like to, drink sweet water. There are times when I like to drink, less sweet water. And so, sometimes, like for instance, I was setting an E. Cummings poem once, and I used a mixture of jazz harmonies for one poem, and then another poem is definitely would be considered classical or concert music. But I just felt that the E. Cummings poetry begged to be that way. And so I felt as a composer, it was my duty not to let it down.
Well, I think for those listening, what I did is I actually went to your YouTube channel and just started listening to everything in a playlist. And it just took me through this diverse set of ideas and images and performers and solo pieces and pieces for group musicians. And I just thought I was thinking, boy, how would I classify this? I said, I don't know really I can other than it's lovely. So I really enjoyed it.
Oh, bless you. Well, Duke Ellington said, once he made a statement about music being beyond category, and I think that's, for me personally, that's high praise. I I don't want to be pigeonholed. I have, studied, all different genres of music, so I'd like to think that I can write in different genres and be true to those particular groups. But I just finished writing a piece for a project called Songs About Buildings, and they asked me to write about a church here in Chicago in Bronzeville, and it was, so they wanted church music, but I used a lot of jazz chords, and jazz and gospel are very similar in that blues is at the foundation of both. And so, generally, when you differentiate between those two, it has to do with the voicings of the chord. In other words, what kind of order are the notes in? Which note is given importance over another, which chord is given importance over another. And jazz people will see the jazz in that piece. The gospel people will definitely see the gospel in there, and it's all about interpretation.
Very cool. Very cool. I had the thrill of recording a haiku for your upcoming and hopefully in person haiku festival planned for this fall in Chicago. I was part of a group of amazing poets from around the world and around the country. Tell me what attracted you to the haiku form, and give me a little bit more background for listeners about the upcoming festival.
Okay, haiku festival. Well, I was taught haiku from the time I was maybe about 6 or 7 years old in elementary school. I went to the oldest Black Catholic school here in Chicago, and the nuns were really, really fabulous. I didn't know until I got out in the world how fabulous they were. I thought everybody was learning Black history. I thought everybody was learning poetry and music. And, it was one of those things, it was not on the books. I mean, when you register your kid, you got the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and of course, religion being the fourth R because it was a Catholic school. But these nuns had a mission, and their mission was to educate Native American and African American kids. And so they went out of their way to teach us about our culture. And so I always learned the poetry of Langston Hughes. I learned the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. When I discovered that she lived here in the city of Chicago, I wrote her a letter, and she did a very dangerous thing. She wrote me back. And so we became pen pals. So here I was, 7 years old, writing letters to Gwendolyn Brooks and sending her my poems. And she was, of course, very gracious. When I look back on them now, they're just god awful, horrible poems. But my mother loved them, and Miss Brooks loved them, and that was good enough for me. And so these nuns taught us haiku, because that's one of the things that people often teach kids because they're short and, they match their attention spans and that kind of thing. Gwendolyn Brooks had a poetry competition at the Museum of Science and Industry. Once a year, she would invite kids to read their poems. She would judge them on the spot and hand out cash awards. She opened her pocketbook and gave kids money. And I was there at that competition. And when she died, I didn't see anyone filling that void. And I talked to her daughter, and I talked to her spiritual son, Haki Marabuti, who's a poet here in Chicago. And neither of them were interested. And I thought, I was just so grateful that she did this for me. So I started Haiku Festival. I founded it in 2004. And we are in our 17th year. But I like haiku because it is brief. I like writing short music. I like writing short poetry. I've written long forms also, but I like small things. I like, I just like people to not to feel like they're being held hostage when they're looking at new art.
That's a great way to describe it.
I love tapas too.
Well, I've been writing for a while, but it's only in the last year that I took the leap of faith to kind of get out of the writing closet and publish and share beyond friends and family. What do you have for advice you have for writers like me who have written for years but have only just started sharing their voice publicly?
I think you're probably at a more exciting juncture in your life as a poet than I am, and you could probably advise me. Sometimes when you've been doing things as long as I have, I've been writing poetry over 50 years. I can't even believe I can sit here and say that. I get bored very easily.
Mhm.
And so I like to try to, do as many new things as I can. One of the things that I like doing is interacting with other poets. I think that's the most important thing because writing, whether it's music or poetry, for me, I need large blocks of uninterrupted time alone. And so when you're always writing and living in your head, you need someone else to tell you, oh, hey, that's not really all that wonderful. It sounds good in your head, but or you need someone to say, hey, don't be so hard on yourself. That's really great. I mean, that's really fabulous. I know for me, whenever I finish writing a piece, there are a handful of people I'll call them and say, could you listen to this? Have you heard this before? Because my greatest nightmare is that I finish my masterpiece and it sounds like Beethoven's Fifth, or it sounds like, Quincy Jones's latest hit or whatever. So I think interacting with people is really important. It's difficult for me to do because people don't believe me when I say this, but I'm very shy. I'm a very ingrown person. So I don't necessarily I don't feel comfortable sometimes showing my work to people, but I know how important that is. I think that is probably the most important thing, not to live in your head so much.
Well,
Now,
I definitely found after decades of writing poetry and sharing with friends and family and not really seeking out in an organized way feedback, how you can create good and sometimes great poetry by yourself, but you can only consistently create great poetry when you have feedback and critique from other poets.
oh yeah. Now I know why my mother, when I was younger, forced me to go outside. Even though I always sneaked a book out, or sneaked out a pen or a piece of paper, but just being out with other people, and writing in different places. I know a lot of people say write, at the same time every day and do this and that. And, sometimes that works for people, sometimes it doesn't. One of my greatest people that I really admire most, Walter Mosley, said he writes wherever he feels like, whenever he feels like. He doesn't try to force himself to block out certain amount of time. And he wrote a beautiful book called This Year You'll Write Your Novel. And it's a good thing for anyone to read any person who is interested in writing a book of poetry, a book of fiction. It's just one of those things where he really lets you know that it's not so out of reach. But anyway,
Terrific.
hopes that answers your question.
Absolutely. So you brought a couple poems to read. So why don't you, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Why don't you read both? And then I've got a question or two about what you wrote.
Okay, the first poem I'd like to read is called Beatitudes, and I wrote this during the pandemic. Beatitudes. Blessed are the dead, for they don't have to make toilet paper runs, count haiku syllables, or bury their survivors. Blessed are the lonely, for their secrets are not detected. Their zits can be popped or left to fester on date night. Blessed are the failures, for success is fleeting. Attempts are countless, and boats that set sail are castles without skies. Cursed are the blessed who cannot see that all is a gift. And that's Beatitudes. The haiku I'd like to read 2 times, and it's untitled. Sliver of sunset, parked between 2 smiling clouds, cricket discussion. Sliver of sunset, parked between 2 smiling clouds, cricket discussion.
Wonderful. And I love from that rehearsal, the recording we did, reading the haikus twice, I thought was is a really good strategy. I'm going to use that when I have a chance to read haiku in open mics and other opportunities. Question, let's start with the haiku. The 2 words cricket discussion to me seem like a perfect example of what makes a haiku so cool and tricky to author. Do you approach haiku as a puzzle to unravel, constrained by the form? Or do you start with a phrase like cricket discussion and then wrap a haiku around it and say, ooh, that could become a haiku?
Of late, I've been writing less and less 575 poetry. I use 575 a lot when I'm teaching just because it makes it easier for me to evaluate and to talk to kids about it. And structure has its place when you're learning poetry. But I always remind kids that 575 is not, it's not a law. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of haiku police out there. I can't stand most of them. And when they're around me, I let them know that I can't stand them. And I point out to young poets that when you look at haiku in other languages, like Japanese especially, it doesn't always break into 575. And so I give them a formula, and hopefully I'll be able to remember the formula having said that. So the first line is about creating an image. And the second line is about creating or describing an action. And then the last line is where you have your irony or your turn or a different, unexpected phrase or whatever. Mm-hmm. So this kind of follows my rule of, the first line, a sliver of sunset creates an image, conjures an image, in your mind. There's an action there parked between two smiling clouds, insinuating that the sun was moving and now it's, stagnant, or it appears to have stopped. And then the irony, the cricket discussion. I was thinking about that last night and I wanted to change the line, and I thought, haiku, any poetry, period. If you are not careful, you will be editing one poem for the rest of your life.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And then I thought, just let it be. I've written several versions of different poems before. Because years ago, I wrote a poem about the ecology, about an oil slick, so horrible that the waves coming into the ocean grew too tired to come in, to go back. Once they landed, they grew too tired to roll back out. And I've rewritten that poem probably 10 times over the past 20 years. So I have to be careful.
I can totally relate to that. That's one thing about publishing a book. At least one version of it is pretty much locked in until the book gets reissued. So just a couple more questions, and then I'll let you get on with what I know will surely be a very busy afternoon. So Beatitudes, you have this Blessed Are the, and it so wonderfully sets up the dead, lonely, failures triad. Take me through how this poem evolved, where, and the sense of where it was in its raw form and how you revised and edited to its final or current form.
Well, just being in this pandemic, I know for me, this has probably been one of the best times of my life as a writer. I've met people from all over the world who have contacted me for music, mostly, some for poetry. And I never would have gotten the opportunity to meet any of those people had we not had this pandemic. Some performers, especially, I heard the phrase once, and I often repeat it. We introverts have to check on the extroverts because they're having a really hard time with this. I'm used to being at home all the time. I'm used to writing, away from others. But people who are extroverted, I got an email from a guy who's in a major symphony orchestra. He's at the top of his game. And it was just one of the saddest emails. He was like, I really need to play some new music. I need to be reminded that I am a professional musician. I haven't had a gig in so long. And so what? I'm, the principal, I won't name his instrument, but I'm a principal player in a major symphony orchestra. I haven't done that in so long. That seems so far removed from my life. And so I just thought, somebody like him is probably really happy that, if he has a dead person in his life, that they don't have to deal with this anymore. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like I've had musician friends who died, and it's like, well, they don't have to worry about, trying to get gigs anymore. They don't have to worry about trying to, keep their ratings up so their record company won't drop them. So I just started thinking about all of the things that we think are so horrible that could be really good things, starting with this pandemic.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how it evolved. And then the whole Beatitudes thing in the Bible, I think it's called the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or whatever he says. It's kind of modeled after that.
I want to thank you, Regina, for taking a few minutes to join the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast. And for listeners, I'll put lots of links in the show notes on how you can follow Regina's works. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James. And thank you for letting me read your book. That was a joy and a privilege.
Oh, man, a privilege to have, as a first-time author, to have someone with your experience read it. So thank you right back. The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at viewlesswings.